So Games Workshop's just dropped the faction rules for the Combat Patrol game mode. Let's take a look through these mini indexes for the armies contained, and take a look at how this more punchy way of playing Warhammer 40k is shaping up. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking Combat Patrol, Games Workshop's new and reimagined way of playing small games of Warhammer 40k, now reinvented to basically be box set versus box set for the actual physical Combat Patrol armies that they sell with their codexes. This is something that they've told us a fair bit about the general idea of, plus given us a bit of a taster of the Tyranids and Space Marines ones, but we haven't really seen the full details with the full indexes and what they have in them. But today we've got a lot more details. Basically, the news today is that every single faction's Combat Patrol rules have just dropped. The vast majority of the currently sold Warhammer 40k Combat Patrol boxes have now got a little download to go with them that tells you about the contents of their rules for playing them in that game mode and any alterations to the datasheets. As mentioned, the main idea for this game mode is that rather than just being, say, 500-point games of Warhammer 40k, you now physically play with the box sets and play, say, Combat Patrol Adeptus Mechanicus versus Genestealer Cults and just literally use the miniatures that come in that set. It means that basically points costs don't really exist, and in theory their aim is to balance the armies against each other with the additional rules that they get. They will talk about how successful that's been in a little bit. I thought in this video we'll take a look through one of these Combat Patrol rule sets, talk about the interesting things with each section, and then talk about how they're going to manage the various aspects of weirdness that comes up with this. Things like certain combat patrols either coming and going, weapons and unit choices within the boxes, and of course the balance changes. One thing that did kind of surprise me with this rules update though is they didn't lift the lid on the actual Combat Patrol core rules. Currently we've got the Warhammer 40k core rules that govern the way that units and armies interact. We now have the Combat Patrol faction specific rules, so how their units and their enhancements and things work in game, but strangely we're missing kind of the glue that joins them together, the actual Combat Patrol mission packs and how you'd be expected to play one force against one other. I'm genuinely a little bit unsure as to whether or not they're going to keep that locked within the core rulebooks. Literally, you just have to get the Leviathan book and read it out of that. Or whether or not they are going to do a digital download for that, the same as all the rest of these faction rules, and that's just coming later. I must admit, if they do decide to just keep it locked within the core rulebooks, that seems like a very strange decision. Combat Patrol looks like it's pretty ideally suited to be the intro way to play 40k. You literally just need to make and assemble one box of miniatures, and then you get to play actual proper games that are somewhat balanced, so I'm not sure why you'd really want to limit people's opportunity to get into that by making the core rules not digital downloads. I guess we'll see how they follow that up in time. Otherwise, the choice of things that do get Combat Patrol rules is interesting. As mentioned, there's been a couple of changes to the Space Marines and Tyranids. Looks like their more recent Combat Patrol boxes just aren't supported in this, and instead you just get rules for the Leviathan box set, which might annoy some. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there's no support for Knight Armigers or Agents of the Imperium either. Neither of those have actual Combat Patrol box sets, but I feel like you maybe could have done something to jury-rig a Combat Patrol rule set together just to allow them to participate, even if you had to do some serious things with the rules like making the Knights significantly easier to kill by small arms. I did also notice that there was a rather interesting change to the Necrons Combat Patrol as well. Looks like they might be getting a new box set, and I'll cover that in the next video. Let's get into one of these rule sets proper though, and say if you decided to look at the Orcs Combat Patrol set, you get the page called Gordrang's Git Stompers. It looks like a lot of these are named after their Strike Force leader, and I do quite like the way that they've given the leaders of the force a bit of a name, makes them all very nice and themed. You get a little bit of intro flavour text as well. Unusually for Orcs, Gordrang's Git Stompers apparently enjoy violence, wouldn't have guessed that. And on the first page as well, you get basically an intro page with a list of the units and what weapons they're equipped with. This is kind of the equivalent of the flip side of the data cards that they don't actually have in these rule sets. Everything basically comes with stock kit, and there are basically no options with how you can equip certain weapons here. The Death Dread is just armed with 3 claws and a rocket, so I guess even if you've equipped it with something else on the physical model, you just use the rules for those. I do quite like the way that they've given a picture of the Combat Patrol as well, and labelled each unit by what it's called. Maybe not the most unhelpful for newer players, just to get a bit more of a grasp of their force. Nice to have a big picture of the force that you're playing with. Then we get into the actual rules for the faction. This pattern follows at least fairly closely to a big 40k's detachment rules. Perhaps the biggest changes are that the army rule and the detachment ability are just really represented by the army rule, and you also have a choice of secondary objectives which the indexes don't have. For the Orcs, their faction rule War is basically unchanged. It's still the same one battle round rule, giving you an invul save, advance and charge, and better combat. Some of the faction rules have been tweaked a bit, say for example Oath of Moment. That one only allows you to reroll hit rolls, as I guess reroll hits and wounds would probably be a bit too much when you could target a unit that is a very big part of your opponent's force. Also on the first page you get the choice of 2 different enhancements for your character leading the force. The box set tells you who your warlord is, and the orcs can make Gordrang either a grizzled scarboy or give him a teleporter, depending on whether he wants a durability boost or a way of just deep striking into battle. One of these always seems to be listed as default as well. I guess that can be helpful for people who just don't want decision paralysis and just want to get going very quickly. And when they've got a grasp of the core rules of 40k, can maybe think about fancier things like swapping out some options. Really, the enhancements and the secondary objectives are the only big choices that you make with the combat patrol, besides how you actually field and use the models in game. The other choice that you can make when you're setting up your army is which secondary objective you're going to go for. The orcs either get one for more points for killing units or looting objectives, and I feel like these secondary objectives are actually a bit of a balance mechanic and are included partly for that purpose. Some of the boxes with weaker combat patrols tend to have very easy secondary objectives, some of the ones that have a very powerful one might have slightly harder ones. Then, kind of not too dissimilar from the detachments, you also get 3 stratagems with command points. The orcs have Get Stuck In, Brutal But Cunning, and Kromp Da Gits. A few of them are a little bit similar to the ones that you can see in the indexes. A few of them have had their power tweaked slightly, and just with the feel and idea of them, I feel like some of them might well be coming in different detachments when we actually get the full codexes for the factions. Again, I feel like some of the stratagems are definitely tailored to allow certain combat patrols to catch up with each other. I definitely feel like a few of the weaker combat patrols tend to have better stratagems than the ones that are stronger. Then after that, we've just got the combat patrol datasheets. Here we've got the one for Warboss Gordrang and his boys. Combat patrol datasheets appear to be clearly marked with the word combat patrol in the top right hand corner. As mentioned, they don't really need 2 sides to these data cards. You can literally just field them with just the one side of the rules. All the army construction bit is done on the first page, plus they don't really have any options as per each unit as well. So all you really need on the cards is the unit profiles and any special rules that they have. For the most part, the raw stat lines and characteristics of the models don't really seem to have been changed all that much on the ones that I've seen so far. I think that's probably really quite a good design decision from Games Workshop. If they decided to modify stats of basic units all over the place, then I feel like they could get people in a real mess and mean that if you were playing Combat Patrol one day and regular 40k another day, you might get very confused as to what your units might do if you had to remember about 5 or 6 different arbitrary changes scattered throughout a bunch of stat lines. The only major change between the index datasheets and the ones in the Combat Patrol datasheets for the most part appears to be to their unit abilities. A lot of the datasheets don't have a bonus special ability or anything like that. Say for example the boys don't have one here, and perhaps if they had 2 abilities they might have had one of them removed but not the other. Say for example Warboss Gordrang has. I guess in this game mode he can't lead units as he doesn't have the leader keyword, and the Deathcopters don't have any bombing run attack on their datasheets. Again, maybe not the worst idea in the world to just cut down a little bit of complexity for a simplified game mode. Some of it might have been done for game balance purposes. My instinct with the actual datasheets though feels more like it's just done for simplicity as opposed to for game balance purposes. Looking through a few more of the Combat Patrol rule sets, I was kind of interested to see how they've done things like different weapon choices. It does appear that they haven't got any sort of single consolidated profile or anything like that. They have just literally picked one of the weapon choices to be the Combat Patrol ones. Usually I think the one that is visible on the artwork in the box. Say for example, if you've got Custodes Virtus Praetors, you can't equip them with salvo launchers in the Combat Patrol game mode, they just get their Hurricane Bolters. As we said for the Orcs, their Death Dread gets a rocket and 3 claws. There's no rules for his various other weapon options. So I guess if you want to play your models in the Combat Patrol game mode, you might be kind of incentivized to model them up as per the rules in this set, or at least magnetized so you've got the option to trade out for them. Realistically though, I feel like it wouldn't really confuse too many people just to play them as proxy. Even if you model your Death Dread a bit differently, just have it use the rules for 3 claws and a rocket. That is always going to be the profile for it in Combat Patrol, it would seem. The system does seem to be kind of similar with unit choices as well. Quite a few of the Combat Patrol sets have either set gear or units that can't really have multi-build options, but some of them definitely do. One prime example might be the Adeptus Mechanicus Combat Patrol, where you've got the choice between the Cataphron Destroyers and the Cataphron Breachers, what different flavour of Battle Servitor you want, plus the Scutari models have the options between Rangers and Vanguard. Generally speaking, the Combat Patrol rules just don't allow for this kind of flexibility. The Adeptus Mechanicus Combat Patrol rules just give you rules literally for the Rangers and just for the Destroyers. So if you are building and painting up a Combat Patrol box set for this game mode, again you might be more tempted to pick those units, and that might create a bit of tension compared with what you might have liked to model them as, or what you might have liked to use in more regular 40k. Again, as with the weapons, I think they've generally just gone by the box art for this and what they've put on the front of the Combat Patrol. Units built up as the ones that you can see, and also the weapons that you can see. As systems go, if they were going to lock it down to anything, that isn't the worst, I guess. I suppose you're not looking at one Combat Patrol, and actually what you need to field is completely different to the one on the art. Otherwise, I was very interested to see how they implemented balance changes in the Combat Patrol game mode. I felt that perhaps the best way to take a look at that might be to see some of the armies that have clearly got the biggest points disparities, maybe Adeptus Custodes and Astra Militarum, one of the highest points out of the Combat Patrols, and also one of the lowest. The Adeptus Custodes certainly have a whole load of points in their box. They really do quite well for getting lots of points out of their miniatures, even in the Combat Patrol box, where they've got 2 Sisters of Silence kits diluting them down. Overall, between those 90-point Virtus Praetors and the 45-point Guard, you've got around about 670 points or so. One of them's used as a basic shield captain. It does seem that their primary mechanism of balance is generally on the supporting rules for the army rather than the datasheets. The squads in the box are equipped with their locked gear, and the stat lines are broadly quite similar. The Custodians have lost a few special rules, but it doesn't really feel like they've been deliberately targeted just to make them way less powerful. What does feel like is trying to rein them in a bit, though, is all their supporting rules. The Martial Qatar is still quite good, it only really loses the one that has the option for precision hits against characters, but the enhancement stratagems and secondaries all seem rather lackluster or a little bit harder to use. Definitely not useless, and they still all add boosts to the army in one way or another, but it definitely feels like what they add is a lot more marginal compared with what certain other armies get. I guess perhaps to help narrow the gap, I guess Virtus Praetors have got just generally a fair bit weaker now in the Custodes index, all sorts of nerfs but keeping the same sort of points cost. Though even with all of this going on, I still feel like the Custodians are going to be an intimidating army to face. You do have 8 models with 3 wounds plus, toughness 6 and 2 plus saves and good invuls, and a lot of the other Combat Patrol boxes don't have the most on the go in terms of heavy weapons. As mentioned, I felt like perhaps a good one to contrast them against would be the Imperial Guard, where going by their Index and Minotaur and Field Manual points, they're more like 365 points, around about 300 points less than the Custodes. Definitely going to struggle when in theory their force is worth roughly half the value. I feel like in their rules though you definitely can see Games Workshop trying to make them catch up a bit. Their enhancements in particular are very powerful. Both of them give you just a free extra command point per turn which will come in handy, plus the option of either whole board orders from one order or lone operative artillery that could be kind of hard to deal with, and also gives them reroll wound rolls on those. The secondaries are also very easy as well, meaning that they'll get ahead on the victory points a bit, at least early on. You basically get free victory points for your opponent not being in your deployment zone, so that very much feels like the pressure is on the opponent, not on the guard there. The stratagems add power as well. Respawning guardsmen for 1 command point definitely feels like that's one way of basically evening up the points disparity. If you can respawn those 65-point squads of Cadian shock troops quite regularly per game, that will even things up a bit, even if their positioning is a bit limited. They've got a nice easy damage one for reroll hits, and a big debuff artillery strike as well, though that one's a bit expensive and just once per game. The datasheets themselves do look broadly similar to the index ones, but with locked war gear. It does seem that Games Workshop's mainly trying to help the guard catch up purely with their core rules for this, perhaps the single biggest thing being the extra command points plus the respawning guardsmen. Both of those are worth quite a bit, particularly at small points levels. Otherwise, out of the indexes, I did notice that there's no rules for these box sets. Combat Patrol Space Marines with the Phobos Space Marines, and the big Tyranid Swarm with all the old Termagants. Kind of surprised they wouldn't even do sort of legacy type rules for these, seeing as they are currently on sale in plenty of places around the world. The same is true of the previous Necron Combat Patrol. They've just got rules for the upcoming one. I can't help but think that this is perhaps a bit unhelpful, seeing as they've been selling these since the Combat Patrol game mode was announced. No clear disclaimers to say that they wouldn't have rules in the upcoming rule set. Probably won't be a widespread problem, but I'm sure at least a few people might well have painted up one of these box sets with the idea of using them in the new Combat Patrol game mode, only to be left disappointed by no rule support. Overall though, my first initial take on this Combat Patrol game mode is that it seems kind of fun. I definitely think it's a game mode of 40k not to take too seriously either way. It's a lot more about putting down a small force of nicely painted models and just rolling some dice and seeing what comes up. I think you definitely want to try and win the game, but probably not take it too seriously as to the winner and loser and the eventual outcome. I feel like a lot of these combat patrols are just going to have bad matchups against other ones, perhaps particularly ones that lack for anti-tank, say fighting the Custodes for example. I guess that overall a fair bunch of them will be at least decently balanced against a fair bunch of others though. I think it's quite a nice idea to have just a set force of armies that in some ways should be roughly balanced, and play some quick punchy Warhammer 40k casual games without having to think about them too hard by the in-game tactics. As I mentioned, I really do hope they'll release the digital missions to actually allow you to play the game mode. Seems very odd that they'd keep that back when they've dropped all the other index rules. Just feels like that's an unnecessary barrier to their gateway game. I will be interested to hear your thoughts though. What do you make of the way that they've implemented this? And would you be keen to play a few games of Combat Patrol with your mates now this rule set is at least mostly out? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.